So to continue with our theme on implementation of pharmacogenomics in the real world setting, it's my pleasure to introduce our next speaker, Diana Brixner. Currently, Diana Brixner is a professor in the Department of Pharmacotherapy at the University of Utah College of Pharmacy in Salt Lake City. She's also the executive director of the department's Outcome Research Center. Dr. Brixner received her baccalaureate degree in pharmacy from the University of Rhode Island and her PhD in medicinal chemistry from the University of Utah. Her research focuses on the design, conduct, and communication of pharmacoeconomic and outcomes research studies to demonstrate the value of pharmaceutical and related therapies, entirely relevant to this section. Dr. Brixner has international collaborations and an appointment at the as an international research associate at the Institute of Public Health in Austria. Her publication record includes over 140 peer-reviewed publications. She's the recipient of numerous awards, serves on a number of editorial boards, and has held executive positions in a number of pharmaceutical companies and professional organizations, including serving as a member of the board of directors for the Academy of Managed Care Pharmacy, the organization for which she currently serves as president. With this background and experience, Dr. Brixner is here to share her perspectives on insurance reimbursement and the payer perspective on pharmacogenomics. Dr. Brixner.
Thank you so much for your introduction. I must say I'm just so excited to see there's still so many people in the room, and I'm also convincing myself it's not because you want to see if you won the book or not, it's because of the content of the last presentation of the day. So with that, I'm very excited to share with you some of the different perspectives on looking at reimbursement, insurance, payer perspective issues around pharmacogenomics. Mark, I think you set me up beautifully. I liked listening to your talk about how can we do this, and then really my question is, how do we pay for it? Who's going to pay for it? So with that, I'm really going to give my presentation through the lens of a payer perspective. So I'll start off talking a little bit about insurance and healthcare spending and some of the realities of what payers are facing right now and the challenges that they need to meet. With that, we'll then talk a little bit about what the promise and potential is for pharmacogenomics in helping to manage that increasing drug spend. I'll talk a little bit then about how reimbursement policy around pharmacogenetic testing has been evolving and will continue to evolve as we go forward. And then last but not least, I'm going to present to you just one very specific challenge around reimbursement for genetic testing, and that is whether it falls in the medical or the pharmacy benefit, and we'll get into some more details at the end of my lecture. So first, I'm sure all of you have seen this slide a million times, but again, it's a setup for dealing with some of the challenges that insurance companies and payers in general look at when managing healthcare and drug spending. We all realize the United States is at the top of the amount of our GDP that we spend on healthcare, the percentage, and also that we're spending close now to $10,000 per person in our country delivering healthcare. Now, this in itself is driven more and more by the increased use of innovative and specialty products. So a couple statistics here. As you can see, about 40% of the spend on drugs now is in the space of specialty pharmaceuticals. These tend to be drugs that are usually infusions, injectables. They're high cost, they're also high touch. They may have REMS programs, other safety pharmacovigilance programs that are associated with them and are driving some of that high cost. We can also see that in 2020, we're actually going to anticipate that 9 of the 10 best-selling drugs by revenue are going to be specialty drugs. And another interesting statistic is although we may be spending 50% of our drug spend on specialty drugs, these specialty products are really only covering maybe 2 to 5% of the entire population. So we're getting to a situation where we're spending the majority of our drug spend on a very small piece of our population that's being treated. So all of these factors come into play that are driving this increase in spend, and therefore the payer, those that are managing that healthcare spend, are very much focused on drugs and how they're being used. Now, what do you do about that? So if you're a payer, if you're a commercial insurance plan, the easiest way to do this is to do the best that you can on managing your own administrative costs and how you run your operations, but then you cost shift. You move these expenses, these increasing costs, onto the consumer. I bet every one of us in the room has felt this. We're the ones that are paying these increasing healthcare premiums year by year. But what strikes me in this recent report by the Kaiser Foundation is the impact of this. So if you look at these lines here, you can see that we're looking at general inflation, general trends on the bottom, growing at a few percent per year as we would expect, cost of living increases, et cetera. But if you look at the top two lines, what we're looking at is the percent increase of healthcare premiums year over year, and then also the percent of those premiums that we, the consumer, are actually paying. And these numbers are up and around 200% increases. So I think this idea, we're running out of time on it. We've about milked it as much as we can, shifting costs on to those of us sitting in the room and the consumer. And we have to start to become more creative as to how we're going to actually manage this healthcare spend and the drug spend in particular. So along come companion diagnostics, pharmacogenomic testing. Is this the answer? So again, this is the part where it's the hope and the promise of companion diagnostics. So from the payer perspective, all of this sounds really good. Let's only pay for these really expensive drugs in the patients who are going to respond. And let's spare spending hundreds of thousands of dollars in patients that won't benefit and maybe even worse, will just get toxicities. So there's clearly a lot of promise. We also want to avoid negative outcomes and side effects that also can be highly expensive that bring no benefit to the patient. So the main question from a payer perspective is, how are we going to look at biomarkers? Are they a savior, or are they yet another barrier in managing drug spend? Are they a gateway to appropriate therapy, or are they a gatekeeper? So I'm going to share with you a couple of examples. Again, this is the perspective through the lens of the payer. So if we look at the difference between companion versus complementary diagnostic, I believe this really helps bring home the impact and the difference of how payers look at the potential benefit of pharmacogenomics. A companion diagnostic is an in vitro diagnostic that is required for the safe and effective use of a corresponding therapeutic product. On the other hand, a complementary diagnostic is an in vitro diagnostic that identifies a biomarker-defined subset of patients that respond particularly well to a drug, and it aids in a risk-benefit assessment for individual patients. However, it is not a prerequisite for receiving the therapeutic product. It just puts individuals on a scale of how much they may or may not benefit from a particular product. So let's look at a case study here of what the financial impact of the different definitions of those two diagnostic tests can have on a payer. So on this particular slide, what you're looking at is the large orange area is the utilization of PD-L1 testing in non-small cell lung cancer. And so what you see here is that the utilization of the drug is very high if you actually know that they're going to respond because of the PD-1 testing. So you actually see a lot of use of a drug, but not so much use of the testing. On the right, what you see is that the use of the drug that has a complementary test is much, much higher because you don't have to test. So from the physician's perspective, I can use a drug where I don't have to test and there aren't any restrictions. On the other hand, if I test more but use the drug that requires the test, there's much less utilization of that particular product. Now, what happened if you move ahead, fast forward to 2017, we now see a complete reversal of this. What happened with nivolumab, the test results came out and we didn't see a particular difference in the PD-L1 testing. And so now the utilization of the drug has in fact gone down dramatically. And the utilization of the product that has a defined test that specifically tells you whether the patient will respond or not is now going through the roof, but appropriately so. So from a payer perspective, within a few years, you saw a complete reversal of spend on two different drugs, and a very different profile on spend of PD-L1 testing in this area. So the financial impact of genetic testing and the appropriate use of drugs because of it can be really significant. So there's now more and more attention to reimbursement policies for genomic sequencing tests. So reimbursement, as we've heard today, is that it has been cited as a key barrier to the adoption of precision medicine into clinical care. There has been a new CMS policy. We heard about that this morning. It was drafted in March of 2018, and this was perceived to provide a major step forward. On the one hand, there is now national coverage for companion diagnostics that have approved indications by the FDA for patients with advanced cancer. However, on the other hand, local coverage decisions can still be made for all other tests. So the second part of it, these local coverage decisions now are still not standardized. And again, each individual local group that makes decisions on policy considers the evidence or lack thereof differently and makes different decisions. From a payer perspective, particularly a national payer that has members in all different regions across the country, managing these different policies can become very challenging. So in general, private and public coverage for next-generation sequencing tests for patients with cancer and those with other conditions is currently limited and variable, and remains so. So how do we try to change this dynamic? Well, what are some of the factors that influence reimbursement decisions? Well, currently, decisions are not necessarily value-based. Reimbursement for diagnostics is typically cost-based and therefore discourages the translation of innovative tests and therapy. So as we look forward to changing and adopting new drug policies, I'm interested to see how genomics is going to play into this. I'm sure all of you are familiar that we have a government right now that is actively trying to pursue lowering all drug prices. And there's some kind of hammer approaches to this, or blunt approaches to this, by eliminating the concept of rebates and focusing just on value-based insurance design and value-based reimbursement decisions. Well, while we look for that to be successful, we also hope that pharmacogenomics and targeting expensive therapies is also another way to decrease overall drug price. But one of the challenges of using a value-based approach in pricing and application of drug therapy is defining value. How are you going to measure the outcome, and how are you able to then convert that metric into an actual price discount when you negotiate? So we'll see how this plays out going forward and how it's going to influence reimbursement decisions for the payer. In general, what we're dealing with is a lack of evidence even on clinical utility, let alone clinical value. The data on the clinical utility is particularly hard to develop. We heard some of that from Mark in the previous conversation and discussion at North Shore. So you're implementing this large scale, but how do you actually determine what the clinical utility is? How are these tests being used? Are the decisions that are being made changed by these tests? And then are the outcomes of these individuals changed by the use and decisions with these tests? So this is a challenge. It's not easy. Outcomes, measurement, metrics, rolling that into pricing is going to be challenging, but we're going to have to deal with this going forward in order to make appropriate reimbursement decisions. Medicare and private insurers generally do not have policies to cover preemptive care. A lot of what I've been talking about is just the issue of companion diagnostics, complementary diagnostics that are tied to a specific drug therapy. As we start to implement some of the tests, for example, tumor mutational burden, and we start to drive therapy by the mutations and not by a cancer or not by a drug, again, this is going to be another difficult challenge for the payer, which is very much used to reimbursing based on a particular drug in a particular disease state. There's a concept called indication-based pricing, which is also looking at if a drug works differently in various indications, why should I be paying the same price for the drug? I should pay more for the drug where there's a better outcome in a larger percent of my population, then I should be paying for a drug that has a less effective outcome in a smaller population. And right now that isn't the case. So we're going to have to advance our policies as we go forward in order to more customize what we're paying for the actual effect of the drug in a patient. And there's a crystal clear role for pharmacogenomics in that. So, considering the evidence we do have today, what is it the payers are looking for? Really two basic concepts. The technology should have some kind of final approval from a regulatory body. We heard about different ways that this can be considered, but again, this is sort of the easy decision that if there's approval, we know that it's been tested and it's associated with the drug and does impact the outcome of that drug. And secondly, the scientific evidence must permit conclusions concerning the effect of the technology on health outcomes. We need to know this test is going to make a difference. Preferably, we'd like to know what that difference is. So for number two, again, this is one of the advantages of being the last speaker, by the way. You can pontificate about what everybody else has said all day. So on number two, one of the interesting comments I heard today was about RCTs, right? And there are some groups that very much insist that the only way we're going to have evidence to tell us whether we should reimburse or utilize this test or not is by an RCT. I don't agree with that. I think patients, providers, payers are going to be very willing to accept good observational data, real-world evidence on the impact of these tests and their outcomes. So what does the value look like? So if we want evidence, if we're willing to accept evidence beyond the RCT, what does this evidence look like? Well, this particular cartoon is just another variety of what we've seen many times today, but it actually puts the economic component to it. As an example, if we look at 100 women with breast cancer after surgery, and we're trying to decide whether we should give them adjuvant chemotherapy or not, we can look at a test, and I would say Oncotype or the Taylor RX information is somewhat applicable here. And we can see that if we don't test and we use normal algorithms to make a decision, maybe 75% of women out of 100 would be put on chemotherapy, and being conservative, 25 you wouldn't put on chemotherapy. On the other end, if you actually test these individuals, it's going to change that dynamic. So once you have the results, now you would only expose 40% of the women to the chemotherapy that would truly benefit, and then 60% would not receive chemotherapy. So if you look at these dynamics and the overall cost per patient, then you recognize that in the tested group, you have to test everyone to determine the 40% that you're going to expose to chemotherapy. However, you then spare the cost of the chemotherapy in more patients because not the same percent received the chemotherapy. So if you roll this out and do the math, what's going on here is you're going to end up paying $7,500 per patient if you don't test them, but you'll pay $8,100 per patient if you test everyone but then spare chemotherapy. So this is designed to not make it easy. It's a bit of a challenge, and again shows what the payer goes through now, is that decision of, am I willing to pay that $600 additional per patient to get that benefit in a group of women with breast cancer? And in this particular case, obviously, you're not paying $4,100. There's a significant cost offset that now really only brings the cost of that test to $600. I could ask how any of you in the room, what decision you might make, but again, these are never easy decisions, and the evidence is never perfect. So let me conclude with a final example of yet another challenge in managing the payment of these genetic tests. And that's this concept of a pharmacy benefit and a medical benefit. So many of the insurance companies actually run these two benefits completely separately. And there are certainly consequences of that. And then in a health plan, an integrated health plan, you see the scenario where the pharmacy and the medical benefit are managed together. Typically in a pharmacy benefit, what we see is the oral oncology agents are covered there. We see patient self-diagnostics, maybe some home infusions, subcutaneous injections will often be more on the pharmacy benefit side. On the other hand, if you look at medical benefit is where we see complex infusions, agents that have these required REM programs for safety, and then also medications that we require specific physician oversight in order to deliver them. Oftentimes, medical benefit products may be covered by what's called a specialty pharmacy that are really well trained in how to manage these products that are over on the medical benefit side. So what falls right in between here is this genetic testing companion diagnostics. Plans can look at this in different ways. Some plans may simply look at all genetic testing on the medical benefit side. Many fewer plans would actually look at all genetic testing on the pharmacy benefit side. Some plans, the test will go with the drug. So if the drug is over here on a pharmacy benefit, then the genetic test may be looked at as well on the pharmacy benefit, whereas if it's an infusion, an oncology drug in the hospital, then the benefit may be on the medical side. Again, there's no standardization. That's another learning that I've seen today. There's so many different areas, from in the CIPIC guidelines, those things really start to help bring some standardization to the decisions that we make. In the PDL1 discussion by Dr. Gupta, the variance just in the test itself brings, again, all of these challenges in who's looking at this and how is the information communicated between these two different benefit type plans. So these are some scenarios that can happen. And again, just another dimension to think about when we look at the application of pharmacogenomic testing. If a drug is covered by the pharmacy and the companion diagnostic is covered by the medical benefit, then in general, the drug will only be used in those who will benefit. It's a situation where the pharmacy and medical benefit are in fact coordinated. However, if your diagnostic test gets approved by the medical benefit, but the drug hasn't been reviewed by the Pharmacy and Therapeutics Committee on the drug side, on the pharmacy benefit, the patients have no access to the drug, even though the test to show that they'd respond to that drug is actually covered. But you can also have the reverse. So let's say the pharmacy benefit is more efficient. They run their formulary committees every month and have decisions out about the drug, but yet the medical benefit hasn't reviewed the test yet. So again, the pharmacy usually won't cover the drug if the test hasn't been conducted, but in this scenario, the patient isn't able to have the test paid for. So in conclusion here, non-coordinated co-payments between the test and the drug will lead to an inability for the patient to access a potential valuable component of their treatment pathway. So some of the challenges this presents is a health plan that has authority of both, is integrated. That would be the ideal scenario. An employer, for example, with a different supplier. One company, insurance company, provides medical, one company provides pharmacy. They won't see that efficiency of coverage and access. When there's coordination between the manufacturer of the drug and the manufacturer of the test, then negotiations can happen in tandem. And finally, even more important, if the drug and the companion diagnostic negotiate independently, health plans have far less negotiating power, and then again, employers and patients are the ones that end up paying higher premiums. So in summary, I hope this has given you a perspective of what the payers are dealing with and some of the challenges and the promise of looking at pharmacogenomic reimbursement. A lot of these diagnostics are primarily driven through prior authorization policies, and complementary diagnostics guide the PA process, and it becomes more difficult because it's not clear when a complementary diagnostic is used if there's a specific subpopulation that will benefit or not. The demonstrated value of testing versus not testing would most certainly drive reimbursement decisions, but we need more of that evidence. Integrating coverage across medical and pharmacy benefit is another way that will hopefully go in the future. It will improve patient access to the right drug, and simultaneous negotiation between the diagnostic and the drug manufacturers can increase efficiency and access and reimbursement through lower pricing and outcomes-based contracting. So thank you very much for your time and attention, and I'll look forward to any questions.
Thank you, Diane.
I'm curious, Diana, and actually the individual who spoke earlier today
Yes.
about the genetic panels that I didn't even know existed. What your perspective, Diana, and maybe others are about insurers, mandate's a bad word, but mandating that before therapy for some complicated chemotherapy regimens go before a panel of experts that would provide feedback appropriate to the oncologist about what therapy should be. I mean, you put up a $10,000 chemo. I don't know what chemo is $10,000 anymore.
I need to add a zero.
Yeah, add a zero because
Yeah,
every
yeah.
chemotherapy is now over $100,000 a regimen.
Yeah.
So I'm just curious on the thoughts of the whole group here about, as payers, we're really struggling with people not following NCCN guidelines. ASCO has guidelines. The regimens, as I analyze them, and others have, 20+% of the time, regimens are really frankly out of bounds for chemotherapy in the United States.
Right.
So thoughts there.
Yeah. Well, so one example is that when these chemotherapy regimens are out of bounds, most payers say, well, we're not going to pay for them. Yeah. So we're going to look at the NCCN guidelines, and if there are pharmacogenomic tests that can help guide those decisions, we'll look at how CIPIC supports that. And if it's 1A, 1B, 2A, 2B, likewise, if it's indicated and covered, then all of these have a prior auth because of the high cost. But if you meet those criteria and you meet the prior authorization, then you can have access. These products then that don't get access because they're not meeting the criteria in the PA, they need to then go through some type of an appeal. And in a payer process, I would think that's where a tumor board, similar to what was discussed this morning, and right now tumor boards are mostly for clinical decisions. I think what we're going to see happening is that more and more these tumor boards are going to be making economic decisions as well, driven by the payers who are either going to pay or not pay for the regimens. It's a great question.
Pat and I have worked together for many years. Kirsten Tyberger with Blue Cross and Blue Shield in Minnesota. So one of the challenges we have here in Minnesota is a very liberal statute that allows use for treatment of cancer if there's at least one peer-reviewed article to support its use. And we're also now being faced more and more often with non-FDA approved drugs that are approved in other countries coming into the United States. And so as a health plan, those are the challenges that we're facing today. So outside of this meeting, I'd like to better understand how this expert panel works here in Minnesota, given our statutes and some of those, I say restrictions, but they're actually, favoring the patient and the doctor.
No, I completely understand because, so in this state, my hypothesis would be that your premiums for a health plan may in fact be higher than they are in other states because you're less able to manage the spend based on indication, based on the results of genetic testing, based on more than one peer-reviewed article of support, to manage some of that spend. Another one that, of course, many of us in the room have watched closely is this whole right to try bill, right? And so now, again, the question is, this right to try, who's actually going to be paying the $100,000 for a drug that hasn't even been approved by the FDA, but the patient feels they now have the right to try? So there are so many dynamics that come into play, and then again, the big question is, who's paying for this? And we have limited resources in making the decisions of what we pay for. Again, the hope of pharmacogenomics is to really help target and help us better define what we pay for brings us the most value.
Hey there. Just a question about pharmacogenomics more broadly than just oncology. So obviously the move in the industry has been towards multi-gene panels, not single gene panels, but most of the coverage decisions are around individual gene drug pairs.
Yep.
And one of the things that I've seen from the insurance side is that there's been a reticence to pay for multi-gene panels, even if it's being ordered for a single gene drug pair, because it's part of a panel, they don't want to pay for it.
Exactly.
But obviously, many people in the room here would see that from a laboratory perspective, there's incremental costs to adding those, very, very small costs to adding those gene panels. So we would see it as cost effective. What's the path forward out of that?
Yeah, no, again, it's another great challenge. So remember, right now in the current environment, the way the payer sees the path to reimbursement is linking to a specific drug in a specific disease state. So when you're asking to have a NGS or a panel paid for that's 10 times as much as a single gene panel, if it's only to make a decision on a single drug, then no, they're not going to pay for the larger panel. So that's sort of the short answer. On the other hand, what you're saying makes a lot of sense. Well, if you're going to pay for one gene anyway, and it's only incrementally a small cost to get a whole panel of genes, and we have the evidence to show that in the long term, a lot of these mutations that we get back in that first test will become useful in further treatment decisions. And the other one that we've learned from our clinical labs is the issue of tissue supply. And so if you go in once and now you have the whole panel of mutations and you don't then have to go back in and draw more tissue that may not be there, there's a cost to that, and it certainly impacts outcomes. But what we need are individual people to do the studies and generate the evidence to show that that is exactly the case. Then the payers have the peer-reviewed articles they need, the evidence-based medicine, the CIPIC guidelines, et cetera, the standards that show you that an NGS or a panel test does make more sense than a single test.
Well, with that, I want to ask everyone to join me in thanking Dr. Brixner once again for a very informative session.